20,000 Roman soldiers marched into a German forest and simply vanished. Not defeated in battle, not captured and ransomed back, completely erased from existence as if they never lived. The man who led them to slaughter spoke perfect Latin, wore Roman armor, and had served the empire faithfully for 6 years. His betrayal was so complete that when news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus went insane, beating his head against palace walls, screaming, "Give me back my legions." The legion numbers were never used again, considered cursed. But how does 20,000 armed men just disappear? The answer will change everything you thought you knew about trust, loyalty, and the true cost of empire. Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. Blood streams down the emperor's face as he beats his skull against bronze doors. Augustus Caesar, master of 50 million souls, conqueror of Egypt, builder of empire, has lost his mind in a single afternoon. His screams echo through marble corridors, where senators once whispered flattery and philosophers once recited verses about the fleeting nature of mortal achievement. Varus, give me back my legions. Guards freeze outside the imperial chambers, hands hovering over sword hilts they dare not draw. In 40 years of civil war and conquest, none have witnessed this sound. The noise absolute power makes when it shatters like pottery dropped on stone. Rain turns Germanic soil to blood-red mud between ancient oaks. 20,000 men lie twisted in segmented armor, their bronze weapons scattered like toys abandoned by angry children. Germanic warriors move through the carnage with methodical efficiency, stripping corpses of anything valuable. Swords still sharp enough to shave, shields bearing unit markings, golden torques that identified Roman officers who will never command again. War cries echo through branches older than Rome itself, primal and triumphant, the voice of the forest celebrating its feast. Bodies in chainmail and scale armor sink into bog water that reflects nothing but death. A cavalry officer's helmet rolls down a slope, its horsehair crest matted with gore that attracts flies already swarming over the greatest Roman military disaster in history. 3 golden eagles lie buried beneath corpses in this killing ground, their wings no longer spread in eternal flight, but folded in barbarian mud like broken promises. The sacred standards that led Roman armies across the known world now rest where Germanic priests will offer them to gods that demand blood sacrifice and human hearts torn from living chests. Back in the Palatine Palace, the ruler of the world tears grey hair from his scalp until wisps fall like ash around shoulders that have borne empire's weight for 4 decades. Palace slaves press against doorways, watching their master discover that some defeats cannot be avenged. Some losses cannot be recovered, some wounds cannot heal. Each vanished eagle cuts deeper than assassin's blades. The 17th Legion carried battle honors from Pompey's pirate wars, had planted Roman standards on shores that never knew civilization before Latin boots touched their sand. Destroyed. The 18th bore scars from Caesar's Gallic campaigns, had watched the Republic die, an empire rise from Republican ashes, annihilated. The 19th was Augustus's own creation, recruited from Italian farms to serve an emperor who promised them glory eternal as the 7 hills themselves. Extinct. Eagles represented more than military banners. They were Jupiter's own birds, blessed by priests in ceremonies older than written law, carried into battle as proof that immortal gods marched beside mortal soldiers. Roman legionaries faced death before surrender, not from patriotism alone, but from religious terror. To lose a standard meant the gods themselves had abandoned their chosen people. Never in 8 centuries of conquest had 3 eagles fallen in a single engagement. Individual Roman forces had perished before. Crassus at Cari, where Parthian arrows darkened the sky. Caesar in Britain, where painted warriors charged through morning mist. But those armies died in honest combat, their standards recovered or ransomed back through diplomatic channels. This was different. This was 20,000 Roman citizens swallowed by darkness, leaving only Germanic laughter echoing through trees that had never felt civilization's axe. The empire at its zenith governs territories that dwarf Alexander's conquests, from Britannia's painted tribes to Syria's desert cities, from Mauritania's mountain kingdoms to Dacia's gold mines. Imperial authority extends across lands that speak 100 languages, but bow to a single law. Tax collectors record tribute in Greek and Latin, Aramaic and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Engineers build aqueducts that carry alpine snow to African deserts. Administrators govern provinces with populations larger than entire kingdoms, once ruled by pharaohs and Persian kings. Even so, this magnificent machinery suddenly feels fragile as autumn leaves. If entire legions can vanish in the northern forests, if discipline forged in 1,000 victories can shatter against barbarian cunning, if sacred birds blessed by Jupiter himself can be defiled on heathen altars, then what foundation supports the edifice that seemed permanent as stone? The empire's northern boundary follows the Rhine like civilization's final statement against chaos. Fortress cities rise where military camps once crouched behind wooden stakes. Vetera commanding the lower valley, Mogontiacum controlling the middle reaches, Argentoratum watching the upper current. Veterans retire with land grants that transform soldiers into farmers. Germanic auxiliaries learn Latin drill commands and proper formation fighting. Merchants follow the standards, bringing wine and olive oil and culture to tribes that barely grasp currency's concept. Beyond that liquid frontier lies the realm of nightmares, Germania. Not empty wilderness awaiting cultivation, but populated darkness that swallows armies whole. Tribes that migrate seasonally, like herds of dangerous beasts. Warriors who paint their faces blue for battle and sing death songs before charging spear points. Gods that demand human sacrifice and fresh hearts, offered on stone altars stained black with centuries of blood. Trees so ancient and vast that sunlight never penetrates to forest floors, where Roman prayers echo unanswered, and discipline dissolves like salt in running water. September's messenger brought word that transforms everything. 3 numbers that will never again appear on military rolls. 17, 18, 19. Legion designations retired forever, considered so cursed that speaking them brings misfortune to other units. The standards that once led triumphant parades through cheering crowds now rest in barbarian hands, their golden feathers plucked for tribal ornaments, their bronze shafts melted down for spear points that will kill more legionaries in battles yet to come. Augustus collapses against marble walls that have witnessed the rise of empire, his forehead pressed to stone, carved by craftsmen who believed their work would last forever. Blood from his torn scalp mingles with tears that no emperor should shed, creating crimson tracks down cheeks that coins bear in profile throughout the civilized world. The forest keeps its secrets while the dead keep their silence, and somewhere in barbarian darkness, golden eagles lie buried like dreams of conquest without limit, waiting for hands that will never dig them free. Arminius speaks perfect Latin. His voice carries no trace of the guttural Germanic tongue that echoes through forest councils, where tribal chiefs plan Rome's destruction. When he dines with Quintilius Varus in the governor's villa overlooking the Rhine, discussing tax collection and military deployments, his accent could have been trained in the forum itself. He wears the scarlet cloak of Roman citizenship, bears the gold ring of equestrian rank, commands auxiliaries who salute him in formation, drill that would satisfy instructors on the Campus Martius. No enemy Rome has ever faced was more dangerous than the one the Empire created. The Prince of the Cherushi sits at Varus's right hand this warm September evening, his Germanic features aristocratic beneath carefully trimmed hair that follows imperial fashion. 25 years old, educated in Rome's finest schools, veteran of campaigns where he earned decorations for valor, Arminius embodies everything the Empire hopes to achieve in its civilizing mission. A barbarian prince transformed into a Roman gentleman, living proof that civilization can tame any wilderness. But beneath that cultivated surface, hatred burns with the patience of banked coals. Servants pour Falernian wine into cups of Alexandrian glass, while the two men discuss Germania's administration as if the forests beyond the river were already as Roman as Tuscany's rolling hills. The governor spreads maps across polished cedar, pointing to tribal territories marked with Latin names that exist only in imperial imagination. His finger traces roads that remain unbuilt, towns that exist only on papyrus, tax districts carved from lands whose people have never seen a Roman coin. The Bructeri have been cooperative with the grain levy, Varus notes, consulting reports written by scribes who rarely venture beyond fortress walls. Though Sergestes continues his complaints about tribute assessments, he glances at Arminius with the mild frustration of an administrator dealing with predictably troublesome provincials. Your father-in-law lacks vision. The conspirator nods gravely, playing the role that has taken 6 years to perfect. The old ways die hard among my people, he replies, using the phrase, my people, with careful irony that the administrator mistakes for assimilation. Sergestes remembers when chiefs answered to no authority beyond tribal councils and blood oaths sworn before sacred groves. What the governor cannot see, what no imperial official can see, is the network already spreading through tribal territories like roots through forest soil. Secret meetings in moonlit clearings where ancient enemies swear new alliances. Messages carried by hunters who move through the wilderness, with knowledge passed down through generations of woodland warfare. Weapons caches hidden in caves that have concealed Germanic treasures since before Caesar first crossed the river. The conspiracy has been building for months, while Varus administers a province that exists primarily in his imagination. Chiefs who smile and nod during daylight councils gather in darkness to plot the extermination of every Latin-speaking soul between the Rhine and Weser. The Bructeri, supposedly cooperative with grain levies, sharpen spears in forest workshops run by smiths who learned their craft making weapons for tribal warfare. The Marzi, who send young men to serve in auxiliary cohorts, teach those same soldiers to recognize Roman tactical weaknesses and remember forest paths that bypass every patrol route. Unity, Arminius whispers to council fires that burn in groves older than the eternal city itself. Unity or slavery. His words carry the authority of one who has seen Empire's heart, who understands that Roman strength lies not in individual courage, but in collective discipline. Discipline that can be shattered if the right pressure strikes at precisely the right moment. Hermann speaks the dialects of a dozen tribes, switching between tongues as easily as changing clothes. To the Cherushi, he is the war leader, son of Segima, keeper of ancient traditions that predate imperial law by centuries. To the Bructeri, he is the young chief who promises their sacred groves will never feel the axe. To the Chatti, he is the warrior who swears their young men will serve tribal gods rather than eagles blessed in Jupiter's temple. But to Varus, he remains the civilized ally, the success story that justifies the Empire's entire Germanic policy. The harvest has been exceptional, the governor continues, consulting tablets that record grain shipments and livestock counts. Your people adapt well to our methods. Another generation, and Germania will be as peaceful as Gaul. He raises his wine cup in a toast that the betrayer returns with steady hands that hide their trembling. To civilization triumphant over barbarism. The prince drinks deeply of wine that tastes like ashes in his mouth, thinking of blood oaths sworn in darkness and promises made to gods who demand more than ritual observance. In 3 days, this civilized dinner conversation will seem like something from another world, a memory so distant it might have happened to different people in a different age. Outside, autumn wind rattles shutters, like the breathing of sleeping giants. The Rhine flows black beneath starlight, carrying messages that only tribal scouts can read. Movements of boats, positioning of guards, weakness in patrol schedules that sharp eyes catalogue for future use. The fortress cities sleep peacefully behind their walls, trusting in stone and discipline to maintain order, in lands that have never truly been conquered. But in the darkness, beyond their lights, forest councils plan the destruction of everything those walls protect. Segestes arrives as the evening deepens, his weathered face bearing the gravity of a man who has lived through the empire's rise, from distant rumor to immediate presence. The chief of the pro-imperial faction among the Cherushi nods respectfully to Quintilius before fixing his son-in-law with eyes that have seen too much treachery in their 7 decades of life. Governor, he begins without preamble, his Latin careful but accented with the authority of one who remembers when chiefs answered to no foreign power. I must speak privately of matters that concern your safety and the security of your forces. The conspirator maintains his expression of polite interest, while his mind calculates risks with the speed that kept him alive through 6 years of deception. The warning he has long expected finally comes, delivered by the one man whose suspicions could unravel everything if taken seriously. But the commander has grown comfortable with tribal politics, viewing disputes as local matters requiring administrative rather than military solutions. Speak freely, the general replies, gesturing for more wine. We are all allies here. The words hang in air, thick with approaching storm, carrying irony that will echo through history like thunder through valleys. All allies, the imperial governor who mistakes occupation for partnership, the Germanic chief who chooses empire over tribe, the prince who serves 2 masters while plotting the destruction of one. In 72 hours, these 3 men will discover which allegiances survive when blood flows in forest darkness and eagles fall silent in barbarian mud. But tonight, they drink wine and discuss administration, while the conspiracy they cannot prevent moves toward completion with the inevitability of seasons changing. Fire crackles in the villa's braziers, casting shadows that dance like forest spirits on painted walls. Beyond those walls, Germania stirs with purposes that imperial intelligence cannot penetrate, civilization cannot govern, military force cannot crush. The serpent in imperial armor raises his cup in another toast, his smile perfect as his Latin, while 20,000 souls march unknowing toward their appointment with history. Vetera rises from the Rhine's west bank, like a declaration of war written in stone and timber. The fortress city commands the river crossing, where Germanic traders once paddled hide boats loaded with amber and furs, now replaced by imperial galleys that patrol waters flowing red with sunset. Walls 30 feet high and 10 feet thick surround barracks that house 8,000 legionaries. their limestone blocks quarried from distant mountains and hauled here by slaves who died building civilization's rampart against chaos. Marcus Caecilius, a 20-year veteran of the Syrian wars, supervises the unloading of supply barges that arrive daily from Gaul. Amphorae of wine, sacks of grain, bundles of woolen cloaks. Everything an army needs to maintain Roman discipline in barbarian lands. His scarred hands, marked by Parthian arrows and desert sun, catalogue inventory with the methodical precision that keeps legions fed and equipped 1,000 miles from home. 40 amphorae of Falernian for the officer's mess he calls to scribes who record every item in duplicate tablets. 200 measures of grain for the ranks, medical supplies for the hospital. Each number represents supply lines that stretch from Mediterranean vineyards to northern forests, a logistical miracle that moves goods faster than Germanic tribes can migrate. Behind him, Germanic auxiliaries practice formation drill under the watchful eyes of centurions who learned their craft in a dozen different wars. The barbarian warriors wear imperial armor and carry regulation shields, but their pale eyes still hold something that 20 years of discipline cannot entirely erase. The memory of forest freedom, of gods who demand more than ritual sacrifice, of loyalty that flows through blood rather than bureaucratic appointment. Downstream, where the river bends toward the North Sea, Mogontiacum sprawls across hills that once knew only Celtic settlements and druidic groves. The fortress city houses 2 full legions, plus auxiliary cohorts drawn from every corner of the empire. Batavians who fight like amphibians, Syrian archers whose arrows can pierce mail at 300 paces, Gallic cavalry whose horses run faster than Germanic ponies. Tribune Aulus Caecina Severus, grandson of men who conquered these lands under Caesar, walks the settlement's paved streets with the casual authority of one born to command. Veterans' wives hang laundry that bears the geometric patterns of distant provinces. Egyptian cotton, Spanish wool, silk that traveled the length of Asia to reach these northern ramparts. Children play with wooden swords while speaking Latin. Their Germanic mothers struggle to pronounce correctly. Another generation, he tells visiting dignitaries from Rome, gesturing towards shops that sell garum and olive oil to customers who grew up drinking fermented mare's milk. Another generation, and you won't be able to tell this place from Ravenna. The confidence in his voice reflects 4 centuries of Roman experience. Patience transforms enemies into citizens. Time makes conquest permanent. Civilization always triumphs over barbarism given sufficient application. But beyond the settlement's walls, the Hercynian forest stretches endlessly eastward, like a green sea that has never known ship or sail. Caesar wrote of trees so vast that their trunks required a day's march to circle, of groves where sunlight never touched earth, of beasts that existed nowhere else in the world. His Gallic commentaries describe the woodland realm as 60 days' journey across, a wilderness so immense that Germanic tribes disappear into its depths for entire seasons, emerging only to raid settlements before vanishing again like ghosts made flesh. No Roman road penetrates more than 20 miles into those depths. The few traders brave enough to venture beyond established routes return with tales that strain credibility, clearings large as battlefields where tribes gather for councils, rivers that run red during certain seasons, mountains made entirely of iron where tribal smiths forge weapons sharper than anything imperial armories produce. At Argentoratum, the southernmost major fortress, Prefect Lucius Stertinius watches supply convoys arrive from Alpine passes with cargo that represents the empire's determination to maintain its presence regardless of cost. Gallic wine, African olive oil, British wool, luxuries that transform military occupation into comfortable civilization. His men eat better than barbarian chiefs, dress in finer cloth than forest priests, sleep in heated barracks, while warriors huddle around fires in temporary camps. The economic machinery that supports this presence operates with mechanical precision. Tax collectors record tribute in currencies that tribal peoples barely understand. Coins bearing imperial portraits to folk who measure wealth in cattle and iron. Engineers survey routes for roads that will connect Rhine fortresses to Elbe settlements that exist only in optimistic planning documents. Merchants calculate profits from trade that assumes peaceful customers who currently sharpen spears in secret. Still, cultural collision creates friction that no amount of military force can entirely suppress. Woodland custom measures justice through blood payment and tribal council, while Roman law demands written contracts and appeals to distant magistrates. Marriage rites that invoke forest gods clash with ceremonies that require Jupiter's blessing. Children grow up speaking Latin in school, but native dialects around fires where grandmothers tell stories of heroes who died fighting foreign invaders. Tacitus later writes of peoples gradually accepting our discipline, but the reality proves more complex than imperial propaganda suggests. In auxiliary barracks, tribal warriors serve eagle standards while dreaming of sacred groves, where their fathers' ashes rest in urns that will never be disturbed by foreign hands. They learn formation fighting and siege techniques, then teach those same skills to cousins who remain beyond the frontier's reach. The boundary itself creates its own strange world, neither fully Roman nor truly barbarian, a hybrid culture that serves imperial needs while nursing resentments that fester like infected wounds. Veterans marry local women and father children who belong fully to neither tradition. Trading posts become towns where Latin mingles with a dozen forest dialects, where imperial coins buy amber that woodland shamans use in rituals older than written history. Intelligence flows both directions across the liquid border. Roman scouts report tribal movements to commanders who plot expansion campaigns, while barbarian spies catalogue fortress weaknesses for councils that meet beneath stars older than empire. Information becomes currency traded by people who live between worlds, loyal to whichever side offers better payment or protection from the other. At night, when fortress gates close and sentries walk their rounds, the forests breathe with life that imperial maps cannot catalogue. Wolves howl in dialects that predate Latin by millennia. Ancient trees creak in wind that carries messages between peoples who navigate by stars rather than milestones, who measure distance in days rather than miles, who remember when the world was wider and Romans were just another tribe competing for survival in a landscape that belonged to no one. The machinery of occupation grinds forward with unstoppable momentum, building roads toward horizons that retreat with every mile gained, establishing order in lands that resist organization, like water resists containment. But something stirs in the darkness beyond firelight, something that understands imperial weakness better than imperial strength, something that waits with predator patience for the moment, when confidence becomes carelessness and routine becomes trap. The iron fist maintains its grip, but the hand inside grows tired, and the forest watches everything, with eyes that count every weakness. 8 years old, hands bound with silk rope, Arminius enters Rome as living collateral for his father's loyalty. The Cherushi prince walks between Praetorian guards whose bronze armor reflects Mediterranean sunlight he has never seen, their measured steps echoing off marble that indigenous forests have never yielded. Behind him lies everything that made him Germanic, hunting grounds where boys learn courage through trials with wild boar, council fires where elders recite genealogies stretching back 20 generations, sacred groves where tribal gods demand blood offerings and human hearts cut from living chests. Ahead lies transformation, more complete than any death and rebirth. The Campus Martius becomes his education in imperial power, its training grounds where patrician boys learn sword work, alongside provincial hostages who represent every corner of the civilized world. Gallic princes swing gladii beside Syrian nobles, while Egyptian royalty practices javelin throws that would satisfy centurions who earned their scars in real combat. The field echoes with Latin commands, shouted in accents that span the known world, unity imposed through shared hardship and competitive honor. Years reshape the forest child into something that serves imperial needs. His Germanic height and woodland reflexes make him formidable with conventional weapons, while his tribal memory for terrain translates into tactical awareness that impresses instructors who learned their craft in actual warfare. Most crucially, his mind absorbs lessons about how empire functions, supply networks, intelligence systems, the administrative machinery that transforms conquered peoples into productive citizens. But memory burns beneath acceptance like coals beneath ash. Arminius serves with distinction in Pannonia, when rebellion erupts across the province like wildfire through dry grassland. Under Tiberius's command, he participates in campaigns that demonstrate both imperial strength and weakness to eyes trained in observation. The hostage watch's legions impose order through systematic brutality. Villages burned for sheltering rebels, prisoners crucified as lessons for survivors, entire communities relocated to prevent future resistance. Yet he also observes how Roman confidence becomes complacency in regions the empire considers pacified. Patrol routes follow predictable schedules that scouts can memorize. Supply convoys travel with escorts sized for bandits rather than coordinated attacks. Officers trust intelligence reports more than personal reconnaissance, maps more than terrain, routine more than instinct developed through generations of warfare. Most importantly, the prince learns that imperial military superiority depends absolutely on fighting under conditions that favor formation discipline. In open terrain, where legions deploy in proper order, barbarian courage breaks against systematic training, like waves against granite cliffs. But in forests where formations cannot form, where ambush replaces frontal assault, where local knowledge matters more than written tactics, even veteran troops become vulnerable to enemies who understand ground better than soldiers crossing it. Marriage to Thusnelda provides the final key to unlock tribal cooperation that has eluded Germanic leaders for centuries. Sergestes' daughter brings more than beauty. Her bloodline connects rival clans through kinship networks that predate Roman presence by generations. The wedding feast blends forest tradition with imperial ceremony. But beneath celebration lies calculation cold as mountain streams. Unity or slavery, Hermann whispers to chiefs who gather in moonlit clearings beyond the Rhine's reach. His words carry authority that comes from understanding both worlds completely, the empire that created him and the tribes that birthed him. Rome divides us with gifts and promises, then devours us separately. Only together can we survive. The conspiracy spreads through forest paths that no Roman scout has mapped. Bructeri warriors who once raided Cherushi settlements now swear common cause against occupiers who threaten all tribal independence. Marsi chiefs who guard their sacred groves from foreign axes agree to coordinate timing with enemies they have fought since before memory began. Chatty warbands pledge spears to coalitions their fathers would have considered impossible. Each tribal grievance becomes a thread in tapestry the betrayer weaves with patient skill. Land confiscations for veteran settlements, sacred sites defiled by foreign temples, young men conscripted for auxiliary service that teaches them to kill their own people, taxes collected in currencies that tribal economies cannot sustain, justice administered by magistrates who speak no forest dialects and understand no woodland law. The prince creates an intelligence network that spans territories from the Rhine to the Elbe, using Germanic servants in fortress cities, auxiliary troops whose loyalty remains tribal despite imperial training, merchants whose trade routes carry messages faster than mounted couriers. Information flows through channels that Roman commanders cannot monitor or intercept, which units patrol, where, when supply convoys travel, how fortress defenses are organized, where weaknesses can be exploited. Trust builds slowly, he tells Varus during one of their evening conferences, his voice carrying conviction that practice has made perfect. But each success creates foundation for greater cooperation. The administrator nods approvingly, seeing proof that patience and proper governance can transform even the wildest barbarians into productive citizens. What the governor cannot see is how trust becomes weapon, how cooperation creates opportunity, how success prepares the ground for betrayal, more complete than any tribal raid ever achieved. The perfect provincial officer sits at his right hand, discussing tax policy and military deployment, with expertise that 6 years of education have refined. In 72 hours, those same discussions will guide 3 legions into forest depths, where expertise becomes irrelevant and education becomes epitaph. The Empire's greatest success story will reveal itself as its most catastrophic failure, proving that some weapons are forged in the armories of those they are destined to destroy. Justice comes to Germania with the rhythmic precision of a water clock. Every morning at the 4th hour, Varus takes his seat beneath painted columns in the headquarters courtyard, his purple-striped toga draped with ceremonial precision that would satisfy senators in the forum itself. Germanic chiefs approach his tribunal like supplicants before an altar, their disputes transformed into legal precedents by an administrator who measures barbarian custom against Roman law and finds it wanting. Land boundaries that tribes have recognized for generations dissolve before written deeds that record ownership in terms forest peoples cannot comprehend. Marriage contracts sealed by blood oaths require imperial validation to carry legal force. Sacred groves where tribal gods have received sacrifice since before memory began must obtain permits from magistrates who worship different deities entirely. Tax collectors work with mechanical efficiency through territories that have never known currency, their bronze scales weighing tribute that transforms tribal wealth into imperial revenue. Cattle that represent generations of careful breeding become numbers in ledgers bound for Rome. Amber gathered from northern shores finds its way into strong boxes that will fund legions fighting in distant provinces. The systematic extraction of wealth operates like siege machinery, designed to drain resistance through economic rather than military pressure. Cassius Dio later records the sums involved: tribute sufficient to fund entire legions, taxes heavy enough to impoverish tribes that once measured wealth in herds and hunting grounds. But numbers on papyrus cannot capture the human cost of policies that treat proud warriors like conquered farmers, that demand submission from peoples who have never bent the knee to foreign authority. Arminius observes this daily theatre of occupation from his privileged position at the governor's right hand. The prince who speaks perfect Latin watches tribal elders forced to prostrate themselves before foreign justice, their dignity sacrificed on altars of administrative efficiency. Each humiliation becomes ammunition for arguments whispered in forest councils, where ancient enemies gather to discuss unprecedented cooperation. Warning signs accumulate like storm clouds gathering on clear horizons, but Varus interprets them through the comfortable lens of successful provincial administration. Supply convoys report increased harassment from bandits who vanish into forest depths before pursuit can organize. Auxiliary troops demonstrate reluctance to patrol certain areas, claiming local taboos that Roman rational thought dismisses as superstition. Germanic servants disappear from fortress households without explanation, their absence explained by homesickness or better opportunities elsewhere. Merchants traveling beyond established routes return with reports of unusual tribal movements, war bands gathering in unprecedented numbers, chiefs holding councils in locations that violate ancient territorial agreements, weapons being forged in quantities that exceed normal hunting needs. Segestes brings his warning to the governor's villa on an evening when wine flows freely and conversation turns to plans for establishing permanent settlements beyond the Weser. The elderly chief's weathered hands shake as he speaks of intelligence gathered from sources he cannot name, without endangering lives already at risk. The administrator listens with polite attention while calculating political motives behind accusations that seem designed to undermine his son-in-law's influence. Tribal jealousy has always complicated governance in lands where kinship matters more than competence, where blood feuds simmer for generations between families that imperial policy tries to unite under common law. His response reflects 4 decades of bureaucratic experience. Acknowledge the concern, investigate through proper channels, avoid precipitous action based on unsubstantiated allegations. The governor who conquered Syria through methodical siege warfare applies the same patient thoroughness to Germanic politics, not understanding that patience becomes weakness when enemies count every delay as opportunity. Meanwhile, the conspiracy spreads through communication networks that operate beyond Roman comprehension. Messages travel along hunting trails that connect territories separated by rivers and tribal boundaries. Shamans carry coded warnings through sacred groves, where imperial authority holds no sway. Young warriors serving in auxiliary units report fortress weaknesses to elders who memorize every detail while maintaining perfect facades of cooperation. Forest smiths work overtime, producing spear points and axe heads that auxiliary troops smuggle beyond checkpoint inspections. Hunters cache weapons in locations that will place armed warriors within striking distance of planned ambush sites. Chiefs coordinate timing through systems based on seasonal migrations and religious festivals that Roman calendars cannot track. The fabricated rebellion emerges from this network with carefully planned credibility. Reports reach Varus through channels he trusts. Auxiliary officers, friendly chiefs, merchants whose trade depends on imperial protection. Distant tribes beyond the eastern boundary have supposedly risen against tax collectors, requiring immediate military intervention to prevent wider revolt that could threaten the entire province. Arminius volunteers his services with the eager loyalty that 6 years of performance have made second nature. His knowledge of tribal territories and languages makes him invaluable for campaigns in regions where Roman maps grow sketchy and intelligence proves unreliable. The governor accepts his offer with gratitude that will echo through history as tragedy's prelude. September arrives with harvest festivals that mask final preparations for slaughter on unprecedented scale. While Germanic auxiliaries participate in ceremonies honoring Roman gods, their thoughts turn to different altars where different sacrifices will soon steam in forest darkness. The prince who earned imperial trust through loyal service prepares to demonstrate how thoroughly Rome has trained its own destroyer. Orders go out for the legions to prepare for movement, not the routine return to winter quarters along established routes. but a punitive expedition that will teach rebellious tribes the cost of challenging imperial authority. Equipment is checked, supplies are loaded, routes are planned through territories that maps mark as pacified. 3 eagles will march into the forest, following guides who have spent 6 years learning how to kill them. The serpent has shed its skin, revealing teeth that gleam like bronze in firelight. September 9th, dawn breaks grey over the Weser camp as 3 legions prepare to march into history. Varus stands on the platform where generals have addressed troops since Caesar's time, watching 20,000 men form ranks with the precision that built empire across 3 continents. The 17th takes its position at column head, eagle gleaming in weak sunlight that filters through clouds heavy with approaching storm. Behind them, baggage trains stretch like segmented serpents, wagons loaded with siege equipment, personal belongings, trade goods that represent portable civilization. The 18th forms the center guard around supply trains that carry everything an army needs to maintain Roman discipline in barbarian lands. Wives and children ride in covered carts beside merchants whose inventories include Gallic pottery, Spanish silver, silk that traveled from beyond Parthia to reach these northern forests. Camp followers trail behind in loose formations, servants, prostitutes, freedmen whose fortunes depend on legionary pay that flows like rivers of gold through territories that have never known coined money. Legion 19 brings up the rear, their eagle standard carried by Aquilifer Lucius Caedicius, whose scarred hands have held that golden bird through campaigns in Syria and Gaul. Behind him, the final baggage trains creak under loads that include official documents, engineering equipment, personal effects that soldiers accumulate during years of service far from Italian soil. 15 miles of humanity stretches across landscape that looks peaceful as a pastoral painting. Infantry cohorts march 6 abreast where paths allow, their hobnailed boots raising dust that will settle on equipment abandoned forever in forest mud. Cavalry scouts range ahead, their horses' iron shoes sparking against stones that will witness the death of discipline itself. The fatal flaw reveals itself to any observer with tactical training. The column extends too far for mutual support between units. If attacked at its center, neither head nor tail can respond quickly enough to provide relief. But Germania has been peaceful for months, its tribes cooperative with tax collection and auxiliary recruitment. What danger could threaten a force this size in territories that maps mark as pacified? Arminius rides alongside the governor, his Germanic features calm beneath a bronze helmet that bears decorations earned in Pannonia's forests. The prince discusses routes with expertise that 6 years of loyal service have made credible. His knowledge of tribal territories and seasonal paths makes him invaluable for campaigns in regions where Roman maps grow sketchy and local intelligence proves crucial. Morning mist rises from streams that flow toward the Rhine, carrying moisture that will thicken into clouds heavy enough to drown armies. The landscape begins its subtle transformation as the column moves east from open country near modern Minden into territories where trees press closer and paths narrow to tracks that barely accommodate military wagons. Weather changes with suspicious suddenness, summer heat giving way to autumn storms that arrive weeks early. Clouds gather overhead with unnatural speed, their grey masses pregnant with rain that will turn packed earth into treacherous mud. Germanic guides who claim knowledge of local conditions assure Varus that the weather will clear before evening, but their eyes hold secrets that no amount of imperial trust can penetrate. The first drops strike bronze helmets like hammer blows on anvils, each impact marking the beginning of transformation that will turn professional soldiers into desperate animals fighting for survival in alien terrain. Rain that begins as scattered moisture becomes steady downpour, then deluge that soaks wool cloaks and leather equipment, until every man carries extra weight that saps strength needed for combat. Armor designed for Mediterranean campaigns proves poorly suited to northern forest warfare. Segmented plates that deflect arrows and sword thrusts become water traps that chill bodies until fingers cannot grip weapons properly. Shields of layered wood and bronze, effective against conventional enemies, grow heavy as millstones when waterlogged. Javelins meant for throwing in formation become burdens that exhaust men before battles begin. Horses panic as lightning crashes overhead with violence that seems to split the sky itself. Cavalry mounts trained for disciplined charges shy at sounds that echo through trees like voices of angry gods. Pack animals carrying essential supplies stumble on paths that become streams, their loads shifting dangerously as drivers struggle to maintain control over beasts that sense approaching doom. Germanic scouts begin their grim work with efficiency that speaks of careful planning. Roman outriders who range ahead of the main column simply disappear, not captured in noisy skirmishes, but eliminated with silent precision that leaves no evidence except empty saddles and horses that return riderless to formations that cannot spare men for search parties. Each vanished patrol represents eyes and ears, lost to an army that depends on information for survival in hostile territory. Without advance warning of obstacles or enemy movements, the column marches blind through landscape that grows more dangerous with every mile. Trees that seemed benevolent in morning light now loom like watchers whose purposes remain hidden beneath branches heavy with rain and darker intentions. The paths narrow to single tracks that barely accommodate wagons designed for Roman roads, forcing the column to stretch even thinner as terrain dictates movement rather than tactical necessity. What began as organized march becomes desperate migration as civilized order breaks down before natural obstacles that no amount of discipline can overcome. Varus rides through gathering darkness, his confidence eroding like riverbanks in flood, as reports filter back from units struggling with conditions no manual addresses. The administrator who imposed justice on barbarian disputes discovers that some forces recognize no human authority, acknowledge no legal precedent except survival, and answer to courts that hold session in forest depths where eagles cannot fly. Night falls early beneath storm clouds that blot out stars, leaving the column to navigate by torchlight that reveals only mud and misery. 20,000 souls march deeper into territory, where maps become irrelevant and experience counts for nothing, led by guides whose loyalty serves masters they have never met. Dawn reveals the trap with merciless clarity. Varus stares at massive oak trunks that block the path ahead, their ancient wood bearing axe marks still weeping sap like blood from fresh wounds. The trees did not fall naturally, they were felled with purpose, positioned with engineering skill that speaks of planning rather than chance. Behind him, similar barriers have appeared during the night, transforming yesterday's route into today's prison. The sickening realization creeps through command ranks like poison through veins. This is coordinated. This is planned. This is betrayal on a scale that Roman intelligence never conceived possible. Wagons that carried portable civilization now become liability that threatens survival itself. Siege engines designed to break barbarian fortifications must be abandoned to mud that swallows wheels and drowns oxen. Personal belongings, accumulated through years of faithful service, scatter across forest floors as soldiers choose between mobility and memory. Centurions order the burning of supplies that cannot be carried, creating funeral pyres for equipment that represented imperial power projected into wilderness that acknowledges no foreign authority. Smoke rises through rain-soaked branches, while officers calculate what can be saved versus what must be sacrificed to preserve the force that matters more than any material possession. The column contracts like a wounded animal, but terrain dictates movement rather than tactical necessity. Paths that barely accommodated yesterday's march now strangle formation, changes that proper deployment requires. Legion 17 presses forward, while 18 and 19 struggle to close ranks through narrows that prevent mutual support between units fighting separate battles. Thunder splits the sky, but thunder does not echo through forest depths with rhythmic precision that speaks of human throats rather than divine voice. Barditus erupts from every direction simultaneously, the war cry that Germanic warriors have chanted since before Caesar crossed the river. The sound rises from hillsides and bog margins, from thickets that conceal enemies who have waited with predator patience for this moment. Not the wild howling of barbarian fury, but organized sound that coordinates attack with precision that Roman tactical manuals never anticipated. Framey fly from forest cover like deadly rain, their iron points seeking gaps in armor that was designed for conventional warfare rather than woodland ambush. The throwing spears that Germanic smiths forged through winter nights now find targets that cannot deploy in formation, cannot create shield walls, cannot respond with coordinated tactics that turn individual warriors into unstoppable collective force. Hit and run becomes the pattern. Tribal warriors strike from concealment, then fade into forest depths where pursuit means death, for soldiers trained to fight in formation rather than as individuals. Each attack removes more men from ranks that cannot afford losses, while Germanic numbers seem to multiply like shadows cast by moving branches. Calcrease becomes a killing ground, its traces left for future generations to study and lament. What seemed an open pass the day before turns into a deadly bottleneck, trapping imperial troops between a bog that swallows armored men and hills concealing foes who cannot be dislodged without forsaking the civilians entrusted to their care. Roman tactical superiority dissolves in terrain that prevents proper deployment. The gladius that dominates Mediterranean battlefields proves useless against enemies who refuse close combat. Shields designed to interlock in formation become individual burdens in forest fighting, where each man faces death alone. Javelins that break barbarian charges catch on branches and become clubs rather than throwing weapons. The remains show Germanic engineering at work, converting natural features into a deadly snare. Concealed ramparts of sand and timber, built with patience over many months, funneled imperial ranks into zones where missile volleys shattered their order. The bog barred northern escape, while constructed defenses guided movement toward positions prepared with precision that even Roman engineers might have admired. Horses panic under missile fire that comes from every direction, their training useless in terrain that prevents cavalry charges or organized retreat. Mount and rider fall together in mud that turns red with blood that will nourish Germanic soil for generations. The animals that survived Syrian heat and Gallic winters die in northern rain that washes their life into earth that belongs to different gods. Command structure fractures like pottery dropped on stone. Centurions cannot see their men through forest cover that transforms military units into collections of individual fighters. Standards become meaningless when formations cannot form. Trumpet calls echo confusingly through trees that muffle sound and confuse direction. Each cohort fights its own battle, while officers struggle to maintain control over forces that terrain has already divided. Varus himself takes wounds from javelins, thrown by enemies who know his position, but cannot be seen to target in return. The governor who administered justice from marble tribunals discovers that Germanic law recognizes only the court of combat, where verdicts are written in blood and appeals are answered with iron. Intelligence networks built over months of careful cultivation reveal their true purpose as auxiliary troops provide information that guides tribal attacks with surgical precision. Where Roman officers are positioned, which units guard the baggage, how communication works between separated formations, all the knowledge that imperial trust shared with Germanic allies now serves enemies who planned this educational exchange from the beginning. Arminius appears throughout the battle like a ghost materializing from forest mist. His perfect Latin used to shout false orders that increase confusion among troops who cannot distinguish friend from foe in woodland chaos. The prince who earned imperial trust through loyal service demonstrates how thoroughly Rome trained the instrument of its own destruction. Individual cohorts discover they fight alone, while believing themselves part of larger force that no longer exists as organized entity. The machine of war that conquered the Mediterranean breaks apart into components that barbarian tactics can defeat separately, though together they might have maintained discipline sufficient to reach safety. Night falls on forces that began the day as 3 legions and end it as scattered groups fighting for survival in alien terrain. Some units maintain formation through centurion leadership that keeps discipline alive when command authority fails. Others dissolve into desperate bands where rank means nothing, and survival depends on individual courage rather than collective training. The trap has closed completely, turning organized withdrawal into chaotic flight through forests that offer no mercy to soldiers whose tactics require open ground and clear sight lines. Germanic patience has been rewarded with Roman blood, and the killing has only begun. Testudo formation becomes death trap in forest fighting. The tortoise that breaks barbarian charges on open battlefields transforms into suicide when trees prevent overhead protection and roots catch interlocked shields. Centurion Marcus Longinus shouts orders that 20 years of training have made instinctive, but his men cannot form the protective shell that deflects arrows and spears. Germanic javelins rain down from elevated positions, while legionaries struggle to raise shields that catch on branches and tangle in undergrowth. Training that conquered Gaul proves worthless in terrain that dictates tactics rather than allowing deployment. The gladius requires close combat to be effective, but tribal warriors refuse engagement that favors Roman swordwork. They strike from concealment with framei designed for throwing, then fade into forest depths where pursuit means individual death for soldiers whose strength lies in collective action. Rain fills segmented armor with water that weighs more than the bronze plates themselves. Legionaries who marched from Syria to Germania discover that lorica segmentata becomes liability when every joint pools liquid that chills bodies until fingers cannot grip weapons properly. Men drown standing upright as water accumulates in armor, designed for Mediterranean warfare rather than northern forest campaigns. Calcres preserves stories no historian ever wrote. Rows of surgical instruments remain just as they were left, dropped by surgeons abandoning posts that crumbled without warning. Bronze scalpels and bone saws sit among martial debris, testimony to medical corps overwhelmed by casualties no system could endure. Prefect Sionius attempts organized breakout from the killing ground, his voice carrying the authority that kept discipline alive through Dalmatian campaigns and Syrian sieges. But forest fighting transforms centurions into isolated squad leaders whose commands cannot reach men they cannot see. Each cohort battles separately while believing itself part of larger force that no longer exists as coordinated entity. Pilum javelins catch on oak branches that turn Roman precision into chaos. The weapons designed to punch through barbarian shields become burdens that exhaust men before combat begins, their iron points snagging on undergrowth that transforms tactical advance into desperate struggle. Soldiers discard throwing spears that served them faithfully across the empire, choosing mobility over firepower in terrain where weight matters more than weapons. Numonius Vala abandons the infantry with cavalry that might still escape the slaughter if speed can overcome woodland obstacles. The commander whose horsemen should provide reconnaissance and flanking support chooses personal survival over duty that binds officers to their men. His desertion spreads panic through ranks that depend on leadership for cohesion, in circumstances no manual addresses. Germanic tactics exploit every weakness that forest conditions create in imperial formations. Tribal warriors attack from concealment, using terrain knowledge passed down through generations, then withdraw before counterattack can organize. They refuse battle that favors legionary training, while choosing engagements that leverage woodland skills that no amount of discipline can match. Heavy scutum shields designed to interlock in formation become individual burdens that sap strength needed for survival in terrain where each man fights alone. The bronze-rimmed protection that stopped Gallic swords and Parthian arrows proves unwieldy in woodland combat, where mobility matters more than defense, where speed saves lives that armor cannot preserve. Medical equipment discovered at the passage includes surgical tools that reveal army doctors' attempts to treat wounds under impossible conditions. Field hospitals that function efficiently in conventional warfare collapse when patients multiply faster than hands can work, and supplies disappear beneath tribal missiles that target medical personnel with deliberate precision. What remains of the camp followers tells of a slaughter beyond pity. Families who marched in hope of protection discovered that Germanic warriors offered none, their gods calling for triumph without restraint. Traders who weighed gain in gold learned the harsher truth that some bargains end in blood. Individual legionaries trained in formation fighting must adapt to woodland combat that negates every advantage their education provided. Soldiers who learn to trust shield brothers for survival find themselves isolated in terrain where unit cohesion dissolves like salt in water. Each man faces mortality alone, while enemy voices echo through trees with calls that coordinate attacks no Roman training anticipated. Lucius Aegius, centurion of Legion 19's second cohort, makes his stand around the unit's eagle, with men whose loyalty transcends rational calculation of survival odds. The Aquilifer who carries the golden bird refuses abandonment even when retreat might save lives, that duty demands be sacrificed for honor that will matter only to historians. But Germanic warriors focus attacks on standards that represent more than military markers to peoples whose gods demand visible trophies of victory. The eagles that led triumphant parades through cheering crowds become targets that draw concentrated assault from enemies who understand their psychological value better than their tactical importance. Weapons designed for Mediterranean warfare fail in Germanic forests where trees turn Roman advantages into liabilities. Curved shields catch on undergrowth, while straight swords require room to maneuver that woodland fighting never provides. Equipment that conquered 3 continents proves inadequate in terrain that favors local knowledge over imperial engineering. Wounded legionaries face choices no military surgeon prepared them to make. Field medicine assumes stable positions where doctors can work while formations hold enemy at distance. But in forest chaos, where front lines exist only in memory, wounded men must choose between abandonment that means certain death and movement that might kill them before enemies can finish the work that tribal spears began. The discipline that built empire crumbles in terrain that recognizes no human authority except survival instincts older than civilization. Veterans who marched from Atlantic shores to Syrian deserts discover that experience means nothing when conditions exceed all previous training, when enemies refuse battle according to rules that made Roman victory inevitable. Forest darkness swallows sounds of individual combat, while Germanic war cries coordinate tribal movements through communication systems that operate beyond imperial understanding. Each Roman death weakens forces that cannot afford losses, while barbarian numbers seem inexhaustible as trees themselves. Night falls on forces that began as 3 legions and face morning as scattered groups fighting for survival without hope of mutual support. The machine of war that conquered the known world breaks into pieces that woodland tactics can destroy separately, though together they might have maintained strength sufficient to reach safety that grows more distant with each fallen comrade. Night of the second day brings counsel that will determine how Roman honor dies in Germanic forests. Varus gathers his surviving officers in a grove where ancient oaks form natural amphitheater around men whose world has collapsed in 48 hours. Tribune Asprenas leans against his wounded side, while Prefect Saonius counts casualties that no amount of tactical skill can replace. Around them, forest darkness pulses with barbarian voices celebrating victory that grows more complete with each passing hour. The general who administered justice from marble tribunals now faces judgment that admits no appeal to higher authority. His purple-striped toga, mark of senatorial dignity, hangs torn and mud-stained from shoulders that bore imperial responsibility until responsibility became impossible burden. Blood seeps through bandages that field surgeons applied before their own deaths claimed them. Pneumonius Vala has already fled with what cavalry could escape the woodland trap. His desertion removes the last mobile force capable of reconnaissance or rapid communication, leaving infantry to face tribal enemies whose knowledge of local terrain makes pursuit suicide and defense hopeless. The commander whose horsemen should provide eyes and ears chose personal survival over duty that binds leaders to their men. The ground keeps memory of the council's end, bronze insignia scattered in ways that reveal a formal gathering, not a panicked rout. Symbols of equestrian rank rest with the belts of tribunes and prefects, their placement marking a final adherence to protocol as the empire's defeat became inescapable. Saonius argues for breakthrough attempt toward the Rhine, his tactical experience suggesting routes that might save fragments of forces too valuable to sacrifice for abstract honor. Individual cohorts could scatter through forest paths, their smaller numbers offering better chances than massed formations that Germanic tactics have proven vulnerable. Some legionaries might reach frontier fortresses to carry word of disaster that will reshape imperial policy. But Varus sees truth that experience has taught him to recognize. No escape exists from trap this carefully planned. The governor who crushed rebellion in Syria through siege warfare understands when walls cannot be breached, when surrender offers only prolonged suffering, when honor demands choices that preserve dignity rather than life. Roman tradition provides precedents stretching back to the Republic's earliest days. Officers who face capture by enemies that practice torture, slavery, or ritual sacrifice choose steel over shame, personal destruction over public humiliation. The blade becomes liberation from circumstances that would transform commanders into entertainment for barbarian councils, where civilized men become objects of tribal amusement. The administrator calls for his armor-bearer, a Syrian slave whose loyalty has survived 6 campaigns and countless administrative crises. The young man appears with equipment that once represented authority projected into barbarian lands. Bronze cuirass polished to mirror brightness. Crimson cloak that marked senatorial rank. Sword belt that carried blades sharp enough to execute justice or preserve honor. Quintilius draws his gladius with hands that sign death warrants and peace treaties with equal facility. The blade catches firelight like captured starfire, its bronze reflecting flames that will die with the men who kindle them. Steel forged in imperial armories will serve its final purpose, not in battle against enemies, but in ceremony that honors traditions older than empire itself. The act follows protocols that Roman dignity has refined through centuries of honorable defeats. No theatrical gestures, no speeches about glory or revenge, simply the practical business of choosing mortality's timing, when circumstances remove all other choices. His example will guide senior commanders whose own honor demands similar decisions rather than survival that abandons everything Roman law considers sacred. Germanic voices grow closer through forest darkness, their celebration marking progress toward positions where the final imperial remnants maintain desperate defense. Tribal warriors demonstrate psychological warfare, learned through generations of forest fighting. Their calls designed to demoralize survivors who understand that no rescue approaches, no relief force marches to their aid. Arminius appears like ghost materializing from woodland mist, his perfect Latin used to offer terms that sound reasonable until examined closely. The prince who earned imperial trust through loyal service now demonstrates how betrayal works when practiced by masters who learned deception in Roman schools, using civilization's own methods against forces that created them. His promises of slavery rather than death, service rather than sacrifice, appeal to legionaries whose training emphasized survival over abstract honor. But officers who understand Germanic religious practices know that prisoners taken in battles, this significant, will serve tribal gods rather than enemy masters. Their hearts cut from living chests on altars that have received human offerings since before Rome learned to write laws. Word spreads through surviving ranks that command authority has ended, that each man must choose his own path through darkness that offers no good options. Some units surrender immediately, their centurions calculating that any chance of life exceeds certain death through continued resistance. Others fight harder, knowing that capture means torture, that Germanic mercy extends only to quick killing of enemies who die with weapons in their hands. Individual courage transcends collective defeat, as legionaries who learn to trust formation, discipline, discover reserves of personal strength that no training provided. Men who depended on shield brothers for survival face mortality alone in terrain, where Roman tactics become irrelevant and barbarian advantages prove overwhelming. The eagles that symbolized divine favor now become targets that concentrate tribal attacks with religious fury. Germanic warriors focus assault on standards that represent more than military markers. They are Jupiter's own birds, proof that Roman gods march beside legionary forces into lands where older deities demand recognition through blood sacrifice. Bodies accumulate around golden banners that aquilifers defend with devotion that transcends rational survival calculation. The sacred symbols that led triumphant parades through cheering crowds become focal points for last stands that honor requires, rather than tactics recommends, duty demands, rather than hope justifies. Senior commanders follow their general's example as Germanic pressure increases beyond any possibility of organized resistance. Steel serves tradition that values honor over life, dignity over survival, Roman death over barbarian captivity. The blades that carved empire from chaos now preserve civilization's values, when civilization itself faces extinction in forests that acknowledge no human law. Marcus Caelius dies with his hands locked around golden wings that will never soar again. The Aquilifer of Legion 17 makes his final stand, where oak trees form natural amphitheater around courage that transcends tactical sense. His scarred fingers, marked by 20 years of faithful service from Syrian deserts to Germanic forests, maintain their grip on bronze, blessed by priests and consecrated in ceremonies older than written law. Around him, the remnants of the first cohort form a shrinking circle that Germanic spears penetrate but cannot entirely break. Blood runs down the standard's shaft, where framey have struck metal that once caught Mediterranean sunlight during triumphal parades through cheering crowds. The bearer who carried Jupiter's bird across 3 continents now defends it with devotion that death cannot diminish, his body becoming final rampart between sacred symbol and Germanic hands that reach for trophies their gods demand. Germanic warriors focus their assault with religious fury that transcends mere military objective. This is not combat, but ceremony, not battle, but worship of deities who measure divine favor in captured standards rather than counted corpses. War cries echo through trees with rhythms that speak of ritual ecstasy, Germanic voices coordinating attack that serves spiritual rather than strategic purposes. The defender staggers under impacts that ring like hammers on anvils, but his grip never loosens on wings that represent more than military equipment. Each Germanic thrust seeks the heart that beats beneath bronze designed for Mediterranean warfare rather than woodland sacrifice. Tribal spears punch through armor, with points forged specifically to penetrate Roman protection. Their iron blessing barbarian altars, where different offerings will honor older gods. The standard bearer falls forward across his eagle, blood from his wounds baptizing golden feathers that will soon adorn Germanic temples where human hearts steam on stone altars. His body covers the standard until Germanic hands drag both flesh and bronze away, separating defender from defended for the first time in 20 years of campaigns, where loyalty meant more than life itself. Legion 18 forms its last defensive square, in a clearing where rain turns earth into crimson paste that speaks of discipline maintained unto death. Centurion Gaius Volusinus commands the formation, with voice that 2 decades of battlefield experience have made steady even when hope dies around him like snuff torches. His men use corpses as rampart against tribal assault, their dead comrades providing final service to eagles they carried faithfully through wars that seemed more significant than this woodland slaughter. The second eagle falls into hands that seek concealment rather than display. Aquilifer, Lucius Petilius, understands that forest priests will transform Jupiter's bird into offering for woodland gods who demand visible proof of victory over foreign invaders. Rather than allow sacred bronze to suffer defilement on altars stained black with human sacrifice, he buries the standard beneath bodies of men who died defending it. His action preserves the eagle for future recovery, while honoring traditions that value divine symbols above personal survival. The golden wings disappear into tribal earth, where they will rest until imperial forces return, with strength sufficient to reclaim what barbarian victory cannot permanently possess. Honor demands that some things remain beyond enemy reach, even when everything else falls into forest hands. Years later, Germanicus leads 8 legions back into these forests to recover standards that represent imperial dignity as much as military equipment. His soldiers find the buried eagle, where loyal hands placed it, still gleaming, despite seasons spent beneath soil that has drunk Roman blood. The recovery provides symbolic victory that helps heal wounds inflicted by defeat, too comprehensive for rational military analysis. Legion 19 suffers shame that will echo through imperial memory until the numbers themselves become cursed. Their eagle falls early when formation discipline collapses under woodland tactics designed to exploit every weakness forest terrain creates in conventional training. The standard vanishes into barbarian hands before its defenders can organize resistance worthy of traditions that stretch back to the Republic's earliest victories. Scattered survivors flee through forest paths that lead nowhere except deeper into territories where tribal knowledge provides overwhelming advantage over soldiers whose training emphasized formation fighting rather than individual survival. Native hunters pursue with efficiency that speaks of planned coordination rather than opportunistic killing, their woodland skills making escape impossible for men whose armor weighs them down in terrain that favors speed over protection. Some legionaries drown in bogs while seeking roots their desperation imagines might lead to safety. Others face individual death among trees that echo with barbarian voices, celebrating victory that grows more complete with each imperial life claimed. The forest that seemed navigable yesterday becomes maze today, its paths leading only to deeper wilderness, where woodland gods hold court over foreign souls. Caldus Caelius experiences survival that proves worse than honorable death alongside his fallen comrades. The young tribune, nephew of the Aquilifer, who died defending his eagle, becomes prize prisoner, whose aristocratic birth marks him for ceremony that native religion requires, rather than quick execution that mercy might provide. His capture begins years of bondage among peoples whose customs include practices that civilized law considers criminal. Tribal captors understand the value of high-ranking prisoners for psychological warfare that extends beyond immediate battlefield victory. The nephew of a fallen standard-bearer becomes living proof that Roman nobility offers no protection from forest justice, that imperial rank means nothing to gods who judge courage rather than birth, that civilization's advantages disappear when barbarian rules replace metropolitan order. Woodland councils decide the fate of captured centurions with deliberation that honors forest deities through human sacrifice performed according to traditions older than Roman law. The officers who maintain discipline through campaigns across the empire die as offerings to native gods whose altars have received blood payment since before Julius Caesar learned tribal names. Their hearts, cut from living chests, water sacred groves where shamans read omens that speak of divine favor, shifting from foreign invaders to woodland defenders. Mass execution becomes religious ceremony that transforms military defeat into spiritual victory for peoples whose gods demand visible proof of triumph over enemies who worship different deities. The leaders who kept legion discipline alive until the end provide final service through deaths that honor barbarian traditions, requiring human offerings for divine favor that tribal warfare seeks. A handful of survivors reach Rhine fortresses with reports that sound like fever dreams to officers whose experience assumes Roman superiority over barbarian capabilities. Their testimonies describe coordination that tribal peoples should not possess, tactics that exceed native military development, betrayal by allies whose loyalty seemed beyond question, until forest darkness revealed true allegiances. The three eagles rest in barbarian hands or woodland earth, their golden wings no longer catching Mediterranean light, but buried in northern darkness where forest gods receive trophies that prove foreign eagles cannot fly in skies that belong to older, hungrier deities. Jupiter's birds have fallen silent in forests that echo only with tribal celebration of victory, complete enough to reshape European balance between civilization and wilderness that acknowledges no imperial authority. Sacred groves echo with Germanic chants that honor gods older than written law. Victory requires ceremony that transforms battlefield carnage into religious triumph. Tribal priests emerging from forest shadows to claim spoils that divine favor has delivered into barbarian hands. The killing ground at Calcaries becomes temple, where shamans perform rites that Tacitus will later describe with Roman horror and fascination. Human sacrifice conducted according to traditions that predate imperial presence by centuries. Weapons nail themselves to ancient oaks through rituals that honor forest deities, who demand visible proof of triumph over foreign invaders. Bronze gladi, an iron spear, points pierced bark that has grown around offerings from previous victories, creating galleries where Germanic gods can admire trophies taken from enemies who worshipped different, weaker deities. Each blade represents prayers answered, divine favor confirmed, tribal strength validated through combat that tested woodland courage against metropolitan discipline. Horse heads mount on wooden stakes that mark boundaries between territories now cleansed of Roman presence and lands that await similar purification. The animals that carried imperial cavalry into barbarian forests serve final purpose as offerings to gods who appreciate sacrifice proportional to victory's magnitude. Severed equine skulls stare with empty sockets toward Rhine fortresses, where survivors carry news of defeat that will reshape imperial policy. Germanic priests select prisoners for ceremonies that honor woodland deities through human sacrifice, performed according to customs that Roman observers find impossible to comprehend or describe without revulsion. Centurions who maintain discipline until death's arrival now provide offerings to gods who judge courage rather than civilization, who measure worth through resistance shown rather than authority claimed. Crude stone altars rise in clearings where Germanic shamans burn prisoners alive, while tribal councils witness divine approval, expressed through smoke that carries prayers to sky gods who favor woodland peoples over foreign invaders. The platforms constructed from forest granite receive hearts cut from living chests, blood offerings that consecrate victory while appeasing deities whose hunger requires human sustenance. Young Marcus Aemilius, a tribune captured during the final assault, discovers that aristocratic birth provides no protection from tribal justice, that recognizes only courage and treats cowardice with contempt that transcends social rank. His screams echo through sacred groves, while Germanic holy men read omens in entrails that still pulse with Mediterranean life, their interpretations confirming divine favor for peoples who trusted woodland gods rather than foreign eagles. 20,000 sets of equipment await division among warriors whose gods have delivered unprecedented victory into barbarian hands. Segmented armor becomes raw material for tribal smiths who understand bronze working but prefer their traditional designs. Shields bearing legion markers transform into ceremonial decorations for chiefs whose authority now extends over territories that Roman maps marked as pacified provinces. Germanic hierarchy determines distribution according to customs that reward courage over birth, participation over position. War leaders claim first choice from spoils that include bronze cuirasses, polished to mirror brightness, cavalry equipment designed for Mediterranean warfare, siege engines that tribal engineers will study and adapt for future conflicts against imperial forces. Individual warriors receive portions based on their contribution to victory that exceeded tribal hopes and surpassed Germanic expectations. Young Segima, nephew of the war leader who planned this triumph, claims a centurion's vine staff as trophy that will remind future generations how woodland courage overcame metropolitan discipline through coordination that transformed ancient enemies into temporary allies. tribal women sought through possessions that speak of lives ended far from Italian soil. Letters from families who will never receive answers. Religious medallions dedicated to gods whose names sound foreign in Germanic tongues. Personal effects that transform abstract casualties into individual tragedies that humanize enemies who seemed invincible until forest warfare proved their vulnerability. Coins bearing imperial portraits flood tribal economies that previously operated through barter systems based on cattle exchange and service obligations. Aurae and denarii stamped with Augustus's profile provide currency for peoples who measure wealth in livestock and land. Their golden faces staring blindly at societies whose values cannot be purchased through monetary systems that Roman administration considered universally applicable. Arminius supervises ceremonies that consecrate triumph while maintaining political alliances that required unprecedented cooperation between peoples whose traditional response to neighbors involved seasonal raiding rather than strategic collaboration. The prince who earned Roman trust through loyal service now demonstrates how betrayal works when practiced by masters who learned deception in imperial schools, their education serving purposes no Roman teacher intended. Messages travel through tribal networks toward courts that will determine whether Germanic victory leads to wider revolt or temporary satisfaction with spoils already gained. Chiefs debate expansion versus consolidation, while their gods feast on offerings that include more than bronze and gold. They consume imperial confidence that seemed unshakable, until woodland warfare proved that Roman superiority depends on fighting under conditions that favor metropolitan advantages. The head of Quintilius Varus, severed according to tribal custom that honors defeated enemies through preservation rather than mere disposal, travels eastward in barbarian hands that will present it to Maroboduus as proof that Germanic coordination can achieve victories that individual tribes never accomplished through independent action. Sacred smoke rises from altars where prisoners burn, while tribal councils witness divine approval for actions that will echo through imperial memory, until the numbers 17, 18, and 19 become too cursed to speak in military contexts. The gods have feasted well on Roman flesh, and their satisfaction promises protection for peoples who trusted forest deities rather than foreign eagles that now rest in barbarian darkness, where their golden wings catch firelight from altars that honor older, hungrier powers. Terror arrives at Vedera on lathered horses, whose riders can barely speak through exhaustion and horror. Lucius Aspernas, commanding the fortress that guards the Rhine's lower reaches, interrogates survivors whose accounts sound like fever dreams born of wounded minds. The handful of legionaries who escaped the forest slaughter speak in broken sentences about 20,000 men simply vanishing, about Germanic coordination that exceeded tribal capabilities, about allies whose betrayal ran deeper than any intelligence failure could explain. Blood still cakes their armor, where Framey found gaps in bronze protection, designed for Mediterranean warfare rather than woodland ambush. Their eyes hold visions that will haunt them until death provides the only escape from memories too terrible for human minds to process completely. When they speak of trees that bled Roman blood and eagles buried in barbarian mud, their voices crack like those of children recounting nightmares that daylight cannot dispel. How many dead? Where exactly? Who betrayed the legions? The questions multiply faster than answers, while runners carry urgent dispatches toward fortress cities that trusted in distance and discipline, to maintain order in territories that maps marked as pacified provinces. Each message adds details that make the disaster more comprehensive, the betrayal more complete, the threat more immediate than frontier commanders prepared to face. Conflicting reports stream in throughout the night as survivors straggle toward Roman positions from different directions. their testimonies creating puzzle pieces that form picture of catastrophe beyond rational military analysis. Some speak of hordes massing for invasion. Others describe tribal celebration that suggests satisfaction with spoils already gained rather than appetite for further conquest. Asperas makes calculations that will determine whether panic spreads through Rhine defenses or discipline maintains order sufficient to organize effective response. Veterans recalled from retirement march through fortress gates, while civilians flee westward from settlements that trusted in imperial protection to shield them from barbarian fury. The garrison commander, who spent his career managing peaceful frontier, discovers that some threats require responses no peacetime experience provides. Emergency measures transform fortress cities into armed camps where suspicion replaces trust, where Germanic auxiliaries face interrogation that assumes guilt rather than innocence. Soldiers whose loyalty seemed beyond question now undergo scrutiny that reveals how thoroughly tribal networks penetrated Roman military structure. Their service records examined for signs of divided allegiance that intelligence officers should have detected before betrayal became massacre. Rhine fleet mobilizes with speed that speaks of training maintained despite years of peaceful patrol duty. Galleys that carried trade goods and tax collectors now transport reinforcements and military supplies, while their crews scan riverbanks for signs of Germanic forces that might attempt crossing into Gallic territory. The waterway that once facilitated commerce becomes barrier that civilization must defend against wilderness that acknowledges no imperial authority. Fortifications strengthen overnight as engineers apply lessons learned through generations of frontier warfare to threats that exceed previous capabilities. Walls designed to resist tribal raids now receive modifications intended to withstand coordinated assault by enemies whose tactical sophistication has been demonstrated through forest victory that no Roman manual anticipated or prepared defensive responses to counter effectively. Rumors spread faster than official communications through civilian populations that trusted in legionary protection for security that suddenly seems fragile as morning frost. Germanic hordes march on the frontier fortresses. Stories claim their numbers swollen by tribes that smell Roman weakness in forest air thick with imperial blood. Children cry for fathers who may already lie dead in woodland graves, while mothers pack possessions for flight toward territories that might offer sanctuary from barbarian vengeance. Scorched earth policies begin implementation east of the river as commanders eliminate everything that might provide aid to tribal forces if Germanic coordination extends beyond forest massacre to invasion of Gallic territories. Granaries burn while their contents scatter on winds that carry smoke towards settlements, where citizens debate whether flight or defense offers better chances for survival that depends on decisions made by generals who face threats beyond their experience. Auxiliary troops under immediate suspicion face disbandment or execution, as frontier commanders struggle to distinguish loyalty from treachery among soldiers whose tribal origins make them suspects regardless of service records. Germanic warriors who served imperial eagles faithfully for decades now endure interrogation that assumes guilt, their protests of innocence interpreted as evidence of deception learned through barbarian cunning rather than metropolitan education. Civilian flight begins at dawn as families abandon homes built over generations, their possessions reduced to what pack animals can carry toward destinations that offer uncertainty rather than guaranteed safety. Merchants whose businesses depended on cross-border trade discover that commerce requires peace, that profit assumes security, that wealth means nothing when highways become battlefields where tribal knowledge provides advantages no amount of gold can purchase. Bridge destruction threatens as panicked officers debate whether preventing Germanic invasion justifies cutting supply lines that connect Rhine defenses to Gallic support networks. Explosives prepared during previous emergencies await orders that could isolate frontier forces from reinforcements, while protecting interior provinces from assault that may never materialize beyond tribal imagination and Roman fear. Agrippina the Elder prevents the catastrophe through intervention that demonstrates how civilian leadership sometimes provides clarity that military panic obscures. The general's wife, who understands strategic implications better than tactical officers, argues that destroying communications serves enemy purposes more effectively than defensive preparations, that isolation weakens frontier defenses rather than strengthening them against threats that coordination might defeat. Her decision preserves links between fortress cities and Gallic reinforcements, while maintaining routes that Tiberius will use to rush northward, with forces sufficient to restore order if Germanic triumph leads to wider revolt. The bridges remain intact, while their defenders prepare for assaults that will test engineering, designed for peaceful commerce against warfare that acknowledges no rules except victory through any means necessary. Still, the great invasion never materializes, despite Roman fears and Germanic capabilities. Arminius leads no march across the frontier river, despite tactical advantages that forest victory has created, despite tribal enthusiasm that spoils and sacrifice have generated, despite opportunities that may never recur if imperial forces reorganize with lessons learned through defeat that cost 20,000 lives. The coalition fragments as individual tribes return to territories with plunder that satisfies immediate needs, while longer-term strategic thinking yields to traditional patterns of seasonal warfare and local concerns. German coordination that achieved impossible victory dissolves into familiar divisions as warrior bands disperse to home territories, where local gods demand attention and tribal obligations reassert authority over broader political cooperation. What secures the frontier is Roman order, not the weakness of the tribes, and it is fear itself, more than invasion, that shapes the borders which Europe will inherit. Terror passes like a storm in the sky, yet beneath the calm the threat endures, cold and certain as the winter that always returns after fleeting warmth. October brings the messenger that transforms emperor into broken old man. The courier reaches Rome 30 days after Germanic spears claimed their final Roman victim, his horse foam-flecked and dying beneath palace gates where Praetorian guards maintain ceremonial watch over empire that no longer seems eternal. Dust from a 1,000-mile ride coats uniform that bore witness to disaster beyond imperial comprehension, while eyes that have seen 20,000 citizens transformed into barbarian trophies struggle to focus on marble steps that lead toward audience with the master of the world. Augustus receives the dispatch in his private study, where afternoon light filters through windows that overlook gardens designed by architects who believed Roman power would endure forever. The wax tablets bearing official confirmation of reports he refused to believe carry seals that make denial impossible. Varus's signet ring, sent by a survivor whose testimony corroborates every nightmare that rumor has whispered through palace corridors for weeks. Disbelief yields to acceptance that shatters imperial confidence like bronze dropped on marble floors. The emperor who rebuilt the world from civil war's ashes discovers that some destruction cannot be rebuilt. Some defeats cannot be transformed into delayed victories. Some losses cut too deep for political solutions to heal completely. The breakdown begins with trembling hands that once signed documents reshaping Mediterranean geography. Suetonius records months of mourning that follow Germanic triumph, imperial hair and beard left uncut, while the ruler of 50 million souls withdraws from public ceremonies that require confidence he no longer possesses. Senate meetings proceed, without emperor who founded the Principate, their debates echoing through chambers where absence speaks louder than presence. Physical symptoms multiply as psychological wounds deepen beyond palace medicine's ability to treat effectively. Head beating against doors becomes ritual that servants hear through marble walls thick enough to muffle screams, but not suffering that transcends architectural barriers. Blood seeps from self-inflicted wounds, while the emperor repeatedly demands restoration impossible for mortal power to provide. Night terrors plague sleep that brings no rest from consciousness, too terrible for dreams to worsen significantly. Palace staff whisper of imperial voices calling through darkness for Quintilius to answer summons that death has made permanent, commanding general, who can no longer obey orders from authority that Germanic spears have permanently severed. The ruler who governed through calculated rationality now experiences madness that calculation cannot cure. Bodyguards face immediate dismissal as Augustus's paranoia extends to anyone whose tribal origins might conceal divided loyalty. Warriors who served faithfully for decades suddenly find themselves exiled from palace service, while their protests of innocence sound like deception to ears that have learned to distrust barbarian voices, regardless of previous demonstrations of reliability. Public reaction spreads through Rome like plague, carried by rumor that official censorship cannot contain entirely. Citizens who trusted in legionary invincibility discover that Roman eagles can fall, that imperial forces can be destroyed, that civilization's advance into barbarism might face permanent reversal rather than temporary setback. Morning conversations in forums and taverns carry undertones of fear that no amount of official reassurance can completely silence. As disaster defies explanation, priests and augurs turn to the heavens, offering interpretations that seek divine meaning where human logic fails. The Romans fear that Jupiter has withdrawn his blessing, for they carried his standards into lands where ancient gods demanded sacrifice in blood, unlike the subdued rituals Rome gave to other conquered deities. In response, ceremonies swell with added gifts, efforts to win back favor. That victory in the forests seems to have shifted to foes whose devotion is sealed in human flesh, rather than fragrant smoke and cups of wine. Senate debates responsibility with passion that reveals underlying tensions between expansion policy and defensive strategy, between confidence that assumed inevitable victory and realism that acknowledges imperial limitations. Patricians who supported Germanic campaigns now distance themselves from policies they previously endorsed, while tribunes demand investigation into intelligence failures that allowed betrayal to develop undetected. Recruitment crisis grips Italian communities as news spreads through regions that provided legionaries for armies that conquered the Mediterranean world. Young men refuse military service that might lead to forest graves, while their families remember prosperity that imperial expansion brought but question costs that Germanic warfare apparently requires. The volunteer system that built empire faces resistance from populations that trusted Roman invincibility until barbarian victory demonstrated imperial mortality. The provinces feel the weight of defeat, their prosperity, built on Germanic trade and tribute, erased by victory that severs those streams for good. Contracts meant to feed armies that no longer march turn into ruinous debts, and replacement costs pile onto a treasury already consumed with works extending from Western Ocean to Eastern Mountains. Those who gambled fortunes on frontier trade discover that stability was never permanent, that their calculations rested on Germanic compliance, that true commerce demands reciprocity rather than exploitation. The gold once feeding Rome's treasuries now fills barbarian hordes, and the empire's books record deficits that reach beyond mere currency. A ruler who had championed expansion now confronts the lessons of woodland defeat, and policy bends to necessity. The Rhine ceases to be a temporary base for conquest, and instead becomes a permanent line of defense, its cities manned by garrisons intended to hold rather than to advance into tribal country, proven resistant to Roman methods. Tiberius assumes greater authority as imperial crisis, demands leadership from generals whose competence Germanic victory has not challenged. Caesar's heir, who earned reputation through successful campaigns, receives responsibilities that require managing defeat rather than celebrating triumph, containing damage rather than expanding conquest, learning humility that empires acquire only through disasters that teach lessons no classroom provides. The ruler who governed through confidence based on inevitable victory now faces governance that assumes possible defeat, imperial policy reformed by Germanic spears that penetrated deeper than barbarian territory. They reached the heart of assumptions that made Roman expansion seem divinely ordained rather than historically contingent. Marble gods offer no comfort to emperor, whose prayers echo through palace chambers, where silence answers imperial pleas for understanding that transcends mortal comprehension. The forest keeps its secrets while the dead keep their silence, and somewhere in barbarian darkness, golden eagles rest in tribal hands that will never release trophies that represent victory over forces that seemed invincible, until woodland warfare proved that Roman superiority depends on fighting under conditions that favor metropolitan advantages. 5 years after Germanic spears claimed 20,000 Roman lives, 8 legions march back into the forest of death. Germanicus, Julius Caesar, leads the greatest force ever assembled for Germanic warfare, his army larger than those that conquered Gaul or crushed Egyptian resistance. Behind him march veterans whose scars tell stories of victories across 3 continents, alongside fresh recruits whose fathers died in woodland graves that this expedition seeks to honor through vengeance that will restore imperial dignity to eagles that barbarian hands defiled. The commander who bears Caesar's name inherited more than imperial blood. He carries responsibility for avenging defeat that cost Augustus his sanity and Rome its sense of invincibility. His mission extends beyond mere military objective to psychological necessity that empire requires for self-respect, proving that Roman power can reach even into forests where tribal gods feast on human hearts. August heat shimmers through trees that witnessed massacre too comprehensive for rational analysis, their branches heavy with memories that no amount of imperial force can entirely erase. The clearing at Teutoburg reveals its secrets reluctantly to soldiers who recognize equipment scattered through undergrowth. Bronze fittings from cavalry harnesses, iron spear points corroded by seasons of rain, helmet fragments that once protected heads now feeding forest soil. Bones lie scattered where Germanic wolves and time have distributed remains of men who died believing Roman discipline could overcome any barbarian resistance. Skulls concentrate near areas that must have served as command posts, their density speaking of officers who died together while attempting to maintain order through chaos that no training anticipated. The sight strikes veteran centurions with force that exceeds battlefield trauma. This is what defeat looks like when it becomes absolute. Soldiers bury their predecessors with ceremony that dead heroes deserve, their remains interred according to Roman ritual, despite Germanic ground that seems reluctant to accept foreign bones. Each burial represents promise that imperial memory will outlive tribal celebration, that Latin prayers will consecrate soil where barbarian gods received offerings of human hearts cut from living chests. Tacitus later describes the scene with historian's precision that fails to capture emotional impact on legionaries who understand their own mortality. through scattered remnants of forces that seemed invincible, until woodland warfare proved Roman vulnerability. The site teaches lessons about empire's limits more effectively than any philosophical treatise, demonstrating that confidence requires validation through victory, rather than assumption of inevitable triumph. The hunt for Arminius becomes personal vendetta that transcends strategic objectives, Caesar's heir seeking the betrayer, whose Germanic cunning transformed loyal ally into Rome's most dangerous enemy. Intelligence networks penetrate tribal territories through methods that combine imperial resources with woodland knowledge, forest auxiliaries who remained faithful providing information about movements that barbarian communication systems cannot entirely conceal. Battle at Idis de Viso demonstrates how Roman adaptation can defeat tribal tactics when imperial forces choose engagement conditions that favor metropolitan advantages over woodland skills. The prince who destroyed 3 legions through ambush and deception finds his warriors exposed to conventional assault, where formation discipline overcomes individual courage, where tactical coordination defeats forest enthusiasm that burns bright but lacks staying power. Still, Hermann escapes through forest paths that tribal knowledge has mapped since before Caesar learned barbarian names. His wounds testament to imperial steel, while his survival proves that woodland gods protect servants who honor ancient obligations. The war leader who unified traditional enemies against foreign occupiers demonstrates cunning that keeps hope alive among peoples who trusted his leadership through victory that seemed impossible until native coordination achieved it. Combat at the Angravarian Wall confirms imperial tactical superiority under conditions that allow proper deployment, while revealing limitations that forest warfare exploits with devastating effectiveness. Tribal warriors fight with desperation that comes from defending homeland against invaders whose presence threatens woodland independence, their courage enhanced by religious conviction that native deities favor indigenous defenders over foreign eagles, forest coordination fragments under pressure that imperial persistence applies through campaigns that drain barbarian resources faster than tribal victories can replace losses. The coalition that achieved impossible triumph at Teutoburg discovers that maintaining unity requires constant success, that failure dissolves alliances based on shared hatred rather than mutual trust, that traditional enemies resume familiar patterns when immediate threats recede. 2 eagles return to imperial hands through battles that cost lives nearly equal to the original massacre, their golden wings reclaimed at price that makes victory seem hollow, despite symbolic importance that empire requires for psychological healing. The standards buried by faithful Aquilophers emerge from woodland soil, where they rested through seasons of barbarian celebration, their bronze still gleaming despite years spent beneath earth that witnessed Latin blood transform into tribal triumph. Tiberius recalls his heir from campaigns that achieved tactical success, while failing to produce strategic victory that would justify their enormous cost. The future emperor, who earned reputation through military competence, understands that some wars cannot be won through conventional means, that forest resistance operates according to principles that transcend battlefield tactics, that woodland peoples fight for survival rather than conquest. Political necessity requires withdrawal, that tribal councils interpret as victory confirmation, despite imperial claims of successful completion. The forces that marched for vengeance return with eagles recovered and honor restored, yet the betrayer remains free in territories where barbarian authority challenges metropolitan claims of pacification. The mission succeeds according to objectives that dignity demanded, while failing to achieve conquest that defeat should have facilitated. Years pass before forest darkness claims Hermann through assassination that tribal politics demands rather than imperial vengeance provides. Fellow Cherushi eliminate their war leader not from metropolitan pressure, but from fear that his growing power threatens traditional structures that woodland society requires for stability. The prince who unified ancient enemies against foreign occupation dies at hands of kinsmen who remember that coalitions serve temporary purposes, while native independence demands permanent vigilance. His death in 21 AD removes the one barbarian leader capable of coordinating resistance that could threaten imperial stability, yet also demonstrates that tribal political systems contain internal contradictions that Latin administrators never needed to exploit directly. Forrest's suspicion of concentrated authority proves more effective than legionary assault in eliminating threats that woodland warfare had made seemingly invincible. The betrayer who spoke perfect Latin dies speaking native dialects in forests that echo with barbarian languages older than imperial law, his legacy preserved in woodland songs that celebrate liberation achieved through coordination that seemed impossible until metropolitan overconfidence provided opportunity that cunning could exploit. His name becomes symbol of resistance among peoples who face imperial expansion, while the empire learns caution that previous victories had made unnecessary. The woodland keeps the tribes free, a realm beyond imperial mastery, still unconquered despite Rome's demonstrations of reach and power into barbarian-marked lands. The trees conceal their secrets, the people retain their sovereignty, and in the forest, darkness fallen eagles linger as omens of the empire's hardest lesson. That some peoples cannot be forced into chains, and some places remain untouchable despite all the might an empire can muster. 17, 18, 19, numbers that die with their eagles in Germanic forests. No imperial decree formally retires the designations that once marched in triumph through cheering crowds. They simply disappear from records as if scribes fear that writing the numerals might summon misfortune upon units that bear cursed digits. Other legions destroyed in battle receive replacements that carry the same numbers, with pride restored through new victories. Yet these three remain buried in woodland graves, where their spirits refuse resurrection that Roman religion cannot provide. Military superstition runs deeper than rational thought among soldiers, whose lives depend on divine favor, interpreted through omens that logical analysis cannot dismiss entirely. Centurions who survived other disasters speak in whispers of eagles that brought doom to their bearers, of numbers that carry forest curses back to Mediterranean battlefields, of spirits that follow standards reclaimed from barbarian altars. Better to create new formations with clean numerals than risk contaminating fresh recruits with hexes that Germanic priests might have woven into bronze and gold. Augustus establishes veteran colonies in distant provinces for survivors whose testimonies sound like madness to ears that never heard forests scream with tribal celebration. Gaul receives settlements where men who escaped woodland slaughter can build new lives among peoples who understand defeat through personal experience with Roman conquest. The colonists carry stories that their children will inherit as cautionary tales about overconfidence and the price that empires pay for assuming inevitable victory. Caldus Caelius emerges from years of bondage with minds scarred by experiences that civilization provides no framework for understanding completely. The young tribune, who entered tribal territories as aristocrat, returns as broken man, whose nightmares echo with barbarian voices celebrating triumph over forces he once believed invincible. His ransom, paid by family members who thought him dead, purchases freedom but cannot restore innocence that woodland captivity stole through methods that Roman law considers criminal. Some survivors disappear entirely into Celtic settlements beyond imperial reach, their shame too deep for Mediterranean light to heal effectively. these ghosts of destroyed armies surface generations later in tribal genealogies that speak of Roman ancestors who abandoned civilization for forest existence, their descendants bearing Latin names in societies that never submitted to eagles that once seemed destined to fly over every corner of the inhabited world. In the wake of disaster, reforms emerge as leaders study the flaws their enemies revealed with brutal clarity. Drills once centered on formations for open battlefields give way to instruction in woodland fighting, where Rome's traditional methods falter. Soldiers adapt to new tactics beneath the trees, and engineers craft gear designed for campaigns in which forests matter more than fortresses. The Rhine becomes permanent frontier through policy decisions that acknowledge limits Augustus never intended to accept during decades of expansion that seemed divinely ordained. Fortress cities receive reinforcements intended for permanent garrison duty rather than forward deployment toward territories that have proven unconquerable through conventional methods. Veterans retire with land grants along the river rather than beyond it, their settlements serving as buffer between civilization and wilderness that acknowledges no foreign authority. Germanic literature preserves tribal memory through songs that celebrate victory over forces that seemed invincible, until woodland cunning demonstrated metropolitan vulnerability. Bards who never learned to write carry epic verses through oral tradition that honors Hermann's triumph while teaching future generations about coordination, that achieved impossible results through unity that transcended traditional enmities. Strategic revolution transforms state policy from expansion toward consolidation, conquest toward defense, aggression toward caution, learned through disaster that cost 20,000 lives and 3 sacred eagles. The empire that once seemed destined to encompass the inhabited world discovers boundaries that cannot be crossed regardless of military force, applied with systematic persistence and unlimited resources. Roman historians struggle with defeat that defies easy explanation or comfortable interpretation. Velleius Paterculus, who served under Tiberius during the revenge campaigns, writes carefully about disaster that reveals governmental limitations while maintaining official narrative that emphasizes barbarian treachery rather than Latin failure to understand enemies whose capabilities exceeded intelligence estimates. Tacitus approaches the subject decades later with historians' perspective that acknowledges tribal virtues while maintaining civilized prejudices about culture versus barbarism. His accounts preserve woodland customs and tactics while interpreting forest victory through metropolitan lens that cannot entirely comprehend tribal warfare's effectiveness against formation discipline that had conquered the known world. The veterans who survived carry memories that shape governmental understanding of frontier warfare for generations, that inherit caution learned through catastrophe. Their experiences inform tactical manuals that emphasize terrain analysis over strategic theory, local intelligence over central planning, adaptation over rigid adherence to methods that succeeded under different conditions against conventional enemies. Interpretations of the defeat diverge. For some, it marks Jupiter's wrath against Roman pride. For others, it is a momentary reversal in a cosmic contest between civilization and savagery, where the gods of Rome will, in the end, triumph. Rituals multiply in the temples, sacrifices made to restore divine favor, though even here a reluctant admission grows that some territories lie outside the celestial mandate embodied by the legion's standards. The cursed numbers rest in legionary memory, like wounds that refuse proper healing, their absence from military registers speaking louder than presence would proclaim. Where 17, 18, and 19 once marched, gaps remain that no amount of recruitment can fill entirely. The ghosts of 3 armies haunt metropolitan consciousness through silence that echoes more persistently than Germanic war cries ever penetrated civilized tranquility. Roman literature chooses silence on the disaster, unwilling to admit that coordinated enemies had found cracks in forces that relied more on heaven's favor than on proven equality in battle. Poets turn to triumphs elsewhere, historians to losses easier to explain, leaving the memory of the forest to the tribes, whose spoken traditions carry truths more enduring than records penned for politics. 4 centuries pass before the frontier moves beyond the Rhine, woodland peoples eventually succumbing to governmental pressure, applied with patience, learned through defeat, that taught Rome to respect enemies whose capabilities exceeded initial estimates. The forest keeps its secrets, while tribal independence yields gradually to civilization that advances through generations rather than campaigns, evolution rather than revolution. Even so, somewhere in barbarian darkness, spirits of fallen eagles brood over defeat that transformed empire's understanding of its own mortality, teaching lessons about limits that gods impose on mortal ambition, regardless of power accumulated through conquest, that seemed ordained by divine will, until woodland spears proved that some victories require prices too high for rational calculation to justify payment. The numbers 17, 18, 19 rest in silence deeper than Germanic graves, their absence from military roles speaking truths that presence could never proclaim, about empires that discover mortality only when forest gods decide that foreign eagles have flown far enough into territories where older, hungrier deities demand recognition through blood sacrifice that metropolitan religion considers abomination. But woodland spirits accept as proper payment for victory over forces that assume divine favor, guaranteed inevitable triumph.